Here are the cities founded by the Etruscans. Today, a quarter of Italy's population lives in them. According to myth, even Rome was founded with the observance of Etruscan rituals. The last kings of Rome were also Etruscans. The Romans adopted the Etruscans' social, political, and military organization, crafts, and arts. The Etruscan religion heavily influenced Roman beliefs. Even the Latin alphabet is just a slightly modified Etruscan one. Through Latin, the Etruscan language has entered our speech. Here are some words of our language that come from Etruscan. Yes, Sergio is an Etruscan name, and it comes from the patrician Sergia family, which also has Etruscan roots. But who were they? Where did they originate? Why are they still remembered? And why did they disappear? Let's figure it out together. Herodotus believed the Etruscans were migrants from the Lydian kingdom in Asia Minor. Indeed, there are analogies between the culture of the Etruscans and the cultures of the civilizations of the Near East. On the other hand, it is unclear why the Etruscans wrote using the Greek alphabet. Why are there no Etruscan settlements on the coastline if they arrived by sea? Moreover, modern genetic studies indicate that the lineage of the Etruscans and the inhabitants of the prehistoric Asia Minor diverged at least in the Neolithic period, millennia before the emergence of the Etruscan civilization. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a 1st century BC historian, instead pointed to the Italian origin of the Etruscans. Until recently, this version was considered a fiction, and Dionysius' desire to curry favor with Octavian Augustus, whose family had Etruscan roots. However, today the continuity of Etruscan civilization from the Villanovan archaeological culture of the Iron Age is becoming more and more evident. For example, the only way to distinguish a late Villanovan burial from an early Etruscan tomb is the presence of an inscription. There are inscriptions Etruscans, no inscriptions Villanovan culture. There are other theories. For example, some scholars speculate that the Etruscans came from the Alps region or migrated to Italy from the island of Sardinia, but these versions are questionable at best. Archaeology shows that the Etruscans spread from Tuscany to the north towards the Alps rather than vice versa. The inhabitants of Sardinia used it to build massive towers called nuraghi, most likely for religious purposes, and there are no such towers in mainland Italy. The most plausible theory is that the Etruscans emerged based on the Villanovan culture while experiencing the influence of the Phoenicians and Greeks, and possibly even mixing with them. For example, we can find echoes of memory of such mixing in the legend of the ancient Roman king Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, who was half Etruscan and half Greek. It is exactly in the 9th and 8th centuries BC Phoenicians and Greeks began to sail to Italy, and it cannot be a coincidence that exactly at this time the Villanovan culture transforms into Etruscan. The Etruscans are surrounded by an aura of mystery, mainly because their language is still not deciphered. They wrote using Greek letters, and every year new papers arise claiming successful reading of the Etruscan texts, both by marginal freaks and reputable scholars. The problem is that none of these attempts agree with the others, and different scholars translate the same texts differently. It is more or less clear that the language is not Indo-European and has an agglutinative structure. About 400 words have been identified, but that's about it. The main problem is that even though a massive number of Etruscan inscriptions were preserved, the vast majority of them consist of only few words and are very uniform. They are either epitaphs like "Here lies Sergio," or votive inscriptions like "I, Sergio, dedicate this sacrifice to god Tinia." Only 8 texts in Etruscan contain more than 50 words. The most notable one is the Liber Lenteus, a linen book. We know that the Etruscans had linen books, but none survived except this one. In the 19th century, a Croatian officer named Mihailo Baric bought a mummy with a sarcophagus in Egypt. The mummy ended up in the Zagreb Museum. An inscription was found on the bandages, but nobody could identify the language until the beginning of the 20th century, when it was finally identified as Etruscan. Somehow, an Etruscan linen book ended up in Egypt and was cut into strips for mummy bandages by local craftsmen. The text of this book represents a religious calendar. It can be understood from the frequently recurring names of the months and the names of the gods, but the book has not yet been fully deciphered. Great hopes for deciphering the Etruscan language emerged in 1961, when archaeologists unearthed Pyrgi tablets. These were gold plates with text in two languages, Etruscan and Phoenician, but unfortunately they didn't match verbatim. The Etruscan text is much longer than the Phoenician one. Two languages are considered related to Etruscan. Firstly, it is the language of the Rhaetian tribes who lived in the Alps. Ancient authors generally referred to Rhaetians as mountain Etruscans. Secondly, it is the language of the island of Lemnos. The ancient Greeks called the inhabitants of Lemnos the same word as the Etruscans, Tyrrhenians. The problem is that we understand the Rhaetian and Lemnian languages even worse than Etruscan. We hope new archaeological findings of longer texts will eventually allow decipher this language. During the Late Bronze Age, around the 12th century BC, the Orenfield culture spread into the Italian peninsula. In Italy, this culture is usually referred to as the proto-villanovan culture. The characteristic feature of this culture is the method of burial. People of this culture cremated their deceased and placed the ashes into biconical urns. By the 10th century BC, the proto-villanovan culture had transformed into Villanovan culture, the direct predecessor of the Etruscan civilization. Villanovans preferred to settle in small communities of 3,000 to 5,000 people on the tops of flat, easily defendable rocks and hills. They still cremated the dead and placed the ashes in urns. As the Villanovans developed and their population grew, a social stratification emerged, which is evident from the burials. Archaeologists found wealthy tombs containing weapons, ritual items and pottery. Finally, at the turn of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Villanovans began to contact the Greeks and Phoenicians. Trade began. Villanovans exported food and iron ore, and imported art objects, pottery and bronze and iron items. Around this time, inscriptions in the Etruscan language started to appear. Evidently the language itself had existed before, but there hadn't been any inscriptions. The burial ritual changed. The cremation was replaced with inhumation. Small tribal settlements on hills turned into well-fortified cities on plateaus and mountaintops. Crafts and arts began to develop. Initially, Etruscan masters simply copied works of Greek artisans. But in the 6th century BC, Persian Empire invaded Ionia. A stream of Greek refugees poured into Etruria. The Etruscan crafts and arts received a huge impetus, and by the end of the 6th century BC, Etruscan art was almost at the same level as Greek. Etruscan pottery, for example, can often be distinguished from Greek only by the mineralogical analysis of the clay. Moreover, a purely Villanovan and an Etruscan type of pottery appeared called buccara. They added soot to the clay, and when the vessel was ready, it was polished until it started to shine. Such pottery looked as if it was made of metal. It's interesting that both the Greeks and the Romans considered the Etruscans to be incredibly promiscuous and decadent. Rumors of the Etruscans' promiscuity stemmed from the high status of women in Etruscan society. For example, Etruscan women feasted and drank wine with the men, which was utterly unacceptable from the perspective of the Greeks and Romans. But erotic motifs in Etruscan art are no more common than in Greek art. Furthermore, the Etruscans loved to sing and to dance, which the patriarchal Romans considered highly indecent. Rumors of the Etruscans' decadence were linked to the fact that Etruscans ate hot food twice or even thrice a day, while the Romans did so only once. The Etruscans achieved particular success in metalworking and jewelry. For example, look at this small pendant depicting the river god Achelous. Isn't it magnificent? Such a delicate work of art. The bird is made of tiny golden grains, each less than a half a millimeter in diameter. The arts of painting and sculpture also flourished. We can see this based on excavation of the rich necropoli near Etruscan cities. The Etruscans built a full-fledged house as a tomb. There they placed a sarcophagus with the body and a lot of items the deceased might require in the afterlife. They richly decorated and painted the tomb's walls and covered the house with a tumulus. The Etruscan military craft also developed. Etruscans fought many wars, not only against their neighbors, but also against other Etruscans. However, their wars rarely were wars of conquest. The goal of the war was to capture trophies, to steal cattle, to steal harvest, and capture slaves. But the Etruscans were not particularly interested in capturing and occupying cities. From ancient times, the Etruscans were also engaged in piracy along the western coast of Italy. In the 7th century BC, Etruscan piracy reached such a scale that neither the Greeks nor the Phoenicians dared to sail beyond Sicily and Sardinia. The Etruscans invented the heavy ram on the rostrum of the ship. Thanks to this, their ships, 50-oared penteconters, became a formidable force for some time. In the 7th century BC, the Etruscans spread throughout Italy along the southern coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea, and to the north along the Po river valley. They established new colonies on Corsica. In the late 7th century BC, Etruscan kings began to rule Rome. Although ancient sources do not state this directly, it looks like Rome became an Etruscan client city, and the Etruscan kings were sort of governors. This period benefited the Romans, who learned much and adopted many crafts and arts from the Etruscans. By the beginning of the 5th century BC, Etruscan civilization had reached the peak of its power. After that, its decline and demise began, but more on that later. The Etruscans believed they received their religion from Tages, a bearded and white-haired infant born from a furrow. Tages dictated to the Etruscans 5 books containing descriptions of rituals and methods of divination. The main gods of the Etruscans were the thunder god Tinia, a counterpart of Zeus or Jupiter, his wife Iune, who migrated to Roman mythology as Juno, the goddess of wisdom Minerva. She was a counterpart of the Greek Athena, also known in ancient Rome as Minerva, and Apollo, who is considered to be the Greek Apollo. However, Apollo himself was borrowed by the Greeks from the east. If the theory of the Aegean origin of the Etruscans is correct, it is quite possible that Apollo was borrowed directly from the Babylonians and Hittites, who had a deity named Abulu. Finally, the goddess of fertility Turan, her closest Roman counterpart is Venus. When speaking about the religion of the Etruscans, one cannot fail to mention their divination using the entrails of sacrificial animals, the flight of birds, and the bolts of lightning. These divinations played a huge role in the life of the Etruscans. No important decision was made without divination. If the omens were bad, everything was simply called off regardless of how important the decision was. Soothsayers by birds were called augurs, by entrails of animals, haruspices, and by lightning, fulgurators. Moreover, haruspices were considered the most important and accurate. To conduct divination, a black ram god was slaughtered. Then its liver was extracted, boiled, and studied. The liver was divided into many sections, each corresponding to a particular god. The task of the haruspices was to find any irregularities in the liver and interpret to which god it belonged and what the god wanted to say. If I was asked to name just one reason for the decline of the Etruscan civilization, I would name just one word: disunity. The lack of unity and centralized rule prevented the Etruscans from dealing with the hardships that befell them in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. At the end of the 6th century BC, the Romans overthrew the rule of the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, and the Etruscans failed to regain control of the city in a series of wars that followed. Soon after this, the Greeks expelled the Etruscans from the Tyrrhenian Sea. In 474 BC, the fleet of Syracuse led by Herodotus defeated the united Carthaginian and Etruscan fleet at Cumae. The Greeks took control of maritime trade in the western Mediterranean. In the late 5th century BC, Rome began its expansion to the north. In 396 BC, the largest city in Europe at that time, Veii, with a population of 400,000 people, fell to the Romans. In 387 BC, the Gauls invaded Italy from the north. They passed through Etruria and sacked Rome and many other cities. The entire 4th century BC was spent in continuous wars between the Etruscans and Romans, resulting in Rome's borders steadily expanding to the north. Etruscans never thought about uniting against the common enemy. On the contrary, it was very often the case that one Etruscan city would assist the Romans in their war against another. Only by the end of the 4th century BC did the Etruscans attempt to create something like a military alliance against Rome. But the Roman war machine had already gained too much momentum to be stopped. By the beginning of the 3rd century BC, Etruscan cities became client cities of Rome. Once under Roman rule, the Etruscans quickly adapted to the new situation and practically did not resist Roman dominion. When Hannibal invaded Italy at the end of the 3rd century BC, not a single Etruscan city sided with him, even though Hannibal had counted on recently conquered Etruscans to rise up against Rome. Over time, many Etruscans became Roman citizens and held key positions in the state, including the Senate. At least 2 consuls during the Republic era were of Etruscan origin. In 27 BC, the residents of Etruria were the first non-Roman people of Italy to receive Roman citizenship. The Etruscans did not disappear during the imperial era. Even some Roman emperors were Etruscans. For example, Herennius Etruscus, Hostilian, Trebonianus Gallus and Volusian. The first Roman emperor Augustus also had Etruscan roots. Emperor Claudius was a great connoisseur of Etruscan language, culture and history. He wrote 20 volumes of history of the Etruscans, which unfortunately were lost and are only known through references in the works of ancient authors. By the 2nd century AD, the Etruscan language had disappeared completely. The Etruscans themselves Romanized and became Romans. Nevertheless, DNA studies of Tuscany residents show that up until the 15th century, most locals were direct descendants of the Etruscans. The Etruscans appeared on the historical stage for the last time in 410 AD. At that time, the Goths led by Alaric besieged Rome. The situation was desperate, and the prefectors of the city and Pope Innocent I turned to the Etruscan haruspices for advice. But the result of the divination was bleak. The haruspices told that Rome would fall, and Rome fell.